So obviously, welcome back to day two. For those I haven't met, my name is Tom Simpson. I'm also known as Tom 2 sometimes. And we were very confused because we had an email chain with Tom Hurka to my left. So we had Toms 1, 2, and 3, but the indexical ordering broke down at that point. So without further ado, Tom Hurka.
Okay, so I've actually known Jeff longer than anyone else here because we met in the fall of 1976 when I was a second-year BPhil student here at Corpus Christi, and Jeff had arrived as a Rhodes Scholar to do a second BA. But we actually didn't have that much contact in the 2 years that we overlapped, and that's sort of reflected in the fact that when our relationship sort of became more substantial, it was when I received a letter from Jeff that began, "You may not remember me, but..." I had submitted an article, a little article about average utilitarianism to Analysis, and they had sent it to Derek Parfit to referee, and he recommended it for publication, but also thought he should send it to Jeff so he could send me even more comments, and that's what the letter contained. And sort of contact continued when Jeff refereed another paper of mine on population policy for the journal Ethics, and he gave me some very good advice that Victor will appreciate. I mean, the paper had some graphs with different curves in it, and in the original version, I named them after baseball pitches. So there was the curve theory, the slider theory, and the changeup theory. And Jeff in his referee's comments said, more politely, "Don't be such a dork." So I took that out. Anyways, and after that, I mean, we became philosophical friends. I haven't interacted with him as intensely or as frequently as people who've been his students or have been his departmental colleagues. But I've always thought of him as kind of, in my generation, of people doing moral philosophy in a certain style, and in Jeff's case, doing it at the highest level. I'll just repeat something. One of Jeff's areas is, of course, morality and war. And just to repeat something Larry said last night, Jeff is the leading proponent of this so-called revisionist version of just war theory. And nowadays, if you write on that topic, you either have to work within Jeff's framework or explain why you're not doing it. Now, about a year and a half ago, there was a similar retirement conference for me in Toronto, and Jeff came and he gave a talk about that 1983 ethics paper of mine, and he kindly and graciously showed how a view that I then thought handled some issues around the repugnant conclusion was actually open to 700 or 800 completely fatal objections. Though to be fair, he also discussed how a view he had been trying to develop at the same time was similarly open to objections. But since he talked about a paper of mine that he refereed, I want to return the favor by taking off from a paper of his that I helped get into print. It was an early paper on just war theory. It was called The Just War and the Gulf War, and it was co-authored with his then Illinois colleague, Robert McKim. It was prompted by the then recent Persian Gulf War of 1991. It contained both some commentary on that war and some more abstract discussion of issues in the theory of just war theory that war highlighted. And because of its commentary side, Jeff wanted it published as quickly as possible. And I had just become one of the editors of the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, and he thought I might be able to do that. I don't know whether I did, because I put it through the regular refereeing process, which it sailed through. Anyways, I'm not going to raise 700 fatal objections to the paper. Instead, I want to discuss an idea it introduced near its start that I found really persuasive and illuminating, and I still find persuasive and illuminating. In later writings, though, Jeff has placed restrictions on this idea or its range of application, first more severe and then somewhat less so, but still more substantial than I think is warranted. So I'll first explain the idea that Jeff and Robert, though from now on I'm going to attribute the paper just to Jeff, first I'll explain the idea that they introduced and then argue against his later restrictions on it or defend his earlier against his later self. I'm just going to throw in something here, something about Jeff's work that other people haven't so far mentioned, and that is that he's often changed his view through time on important topics. So just for example, on what the ground is for liability to defensive harm. So he's not a philosopher who, works out a view on a topic and then spends the rest of his career defending that view without any changes. He's always been open to persuasion by other philosophers that his arguments or views are mistaken, or he'll arrive at that conclusion himself. And I just think that shows a distinctive kind of philosophical integrity, or a more ego-free pursuit of philosophical truth than most of the rest of us are capable of. Now, having said that, I'm going to be talking about a case where he changed his view, I think, for the worse. So what's the idea? The basic idea involved a distinction between two kinds of just cause for war, which in later and better terminology, he would call independent and conditional just causes. So an independent just cause involves a type of good that war can promote and that by itself satisfies the just cause condition for war, where a war has to satisfy this condition to be permissible. So no matter how much other good a war may do, if it lacks a just cause of this kind, or won't further one of the specific types of good in some such cause, it's unjust. The most familiar independent just cause is resisting aggression by trying to prevent it or reverse its effects. And though there may be other such causes, there's only a small number, and to be permissible, a war has to have at least one of these independent just causes. But the paper introduced a further category of merely conditional just causes. These don't on their own satisfy the just cause condition, so if a war has only one of them, it's not permitted. But if a war has some other independent just cause, the conditional causes become legitimate aims in war and can count in favor of its permissibility. And the two main such causes it discussed were the forcible disarmament of an enemy nation to make it in or less capable of aggression in the future, or deterrence, or dissuading it and other nations from aggression in the future. And the fact that these causes are conditional means that if a nation hasn't, say, committed aggression, the fact that it may or even is likely to aggress in the future is no justification for disarming it now. There's no such broad right of preventive war. Once it has aggressed, however, forcibly disarming it can be permitted, as it was of Germany and Japan after World War II. Similarly, if a nation hasn't aggressed, the fact that war against it would deter it and others from future aggression doesn't justify war against it now. Once it has aggressed, however, that a war would have these deterrent effects can count in its favor. And in introducing this idea, the paper drew a parallel with criminal punishment. If someone hasn't committed a crime, the fact that he may or is likely to commit crimes in the future is no justification for imprisoning him now. Once he has acted criminally, however, imprisoning him to prevent his doing so again is legitimate and even a central purpose of punishment. That imprisoning someone who hasn't committed a crime would deter others is likewise no justification for imprisoning him. But once he's acted criminally, using his imprisonment to deter others is again permitted and can help determine how long he's imprisoned. You might give somebody a longer sentence because that would deter others more. So that discernment and deterrence are only conditionally permitted in war, parallels the way these analogs are only conditionally permitted in punishment. Perhaps a little surprisingly, given his later work, Jeff's later work, the paper didn't say that a nation's committing aggression makes it liable to the use of force to disarm it or deter others. The word liable appeared only once in the paper and in a different context. But to me, at least, it would be natural to say that if a nation gives others an independent just cause for war, say by committing aggression, it makes itself and its soldiers liable to force not only to resist that aggression, but also to further the conditional causes of disarmament and deterrence. The additional liability is, however, limited to these specific causes. A nation's committing aggression doesn't permit an opponent to enslave its citizens after the war or destroy all its civilian infrastructure. Just as someone's committing a crime doesn't permit the state to use him in involuntary medical experiments. And the paper suggested that what separates the legitimate conditional causes and what separates the conditional causes and makes their pursuit legitimate is they're somehow relating to and promoting the general aim of just warfare, which is the prevention or rectification of wrongs like aggression. That's something disarmament and deterrence do. They make future aggression less likely, as enslaving citizens does not. But whether or not this explanation succeeds, it's to me at least intuitively plausible that disarmament and deterrence are permitted aims in war, given some other independent just cause. Now, if the conditional causes contribute to the case for war, they do so more specifically by helping it satisfy the ad bellum proportionality and necessity conditions. The proportionality condition weighs the relevant goods a war will produce against its harms and requires the goods to exceed the harms or not be too much smaller. But the paper argued that not all the goods a war will produce are relevant. It may be that by stimulating military production, a war will boost our nation's and even global GDP, but that, it said, doesn't bear on its proportionality. An otherwise impermissible war can't become permissible because of merely economic effects. What weighs on the positive side of a proportionality assessment, it argued, is only the goods in the war's just causes, where these can include conditional ones. Thus, more force can be permitted in a war with the conditional cause of deterrence than if it had only its independent just cause. A conditional cause can even make an otherwise disproportionate war proportionate, as it might have done in the Falklands War. I mean, the proposed justifications for the Falklands War were both that it would restore British sovereignty over the islands and that it would reinforce a norm against international aggression. And it may be that if the war was proportionate, it was only given the second deterrence justification. And I'd add that another possible effect of a conditional cause like deterrence is to change a war from one which other states are permitted but not required to join to one they have an obligation to participate in. Conditional causes can also contribute to satisfying the necessity condition, which says a war is impermissible if there's some other less harmful way of achieving its just causes. This condition doesn't, as some think, require a state to try every possible alternative to war before resorting to it. Different ways of pursuing the just causes can differ in how successfully they'll do so, and an assessment of a war as a necessity has to consider these differences. Now, one that paper noted has to do with probability, when an alternative to war has a lower probability of achieving its just causes. But another is when it will achieve them to a lesser degree. For example, when it might regain only part, but not all of an occupied territory. And here again, conditional causes can be relevant. It may be that whereas war against an aggressor would result in its disarmament and heightened deterrence of others, a non-military alternative would do neither of these things. And while this may not make the war, all things considered, permitted, it does count in its favor. I'll just add that the paper didn't place certain limits it could have placed on these conditional just causes. So it didn't say that to be permitted to pursue disarmament, you have to, at the time, have an independent just cause. That can't be required if disarming an aggressor is permitted after its aggression has been reversed, as Germany's and Japan's aggressions had been reversed in 1945. Nor did it say that you have to care about the war's independent just causes or do anything to promote them. It allowed that you might join a just war only in order to disarm the aggressor, perhaps to disable it from attacking you later, and with no interest in its current aggression. Nor did it say that you may fight only to restore the level of deterrence to what it was before the aggression. Nothing in the paper forbade trying to use the war to improve the level of aggression over what it was before the aggression occurred. So, I mean, as the paper rightly said, I'm just expressing my agreement, treating disarmament and deterrence as conditional just causes recognizes their importance in the assessment of a war without granting a more general license for preventive or deterrent war, as a simple consequentialist theory might. It both gives them a role and also limits that role. And it connects with the common emphasis in foreign policy debates on international security, where that's partly a matter of nations internalizing a norm of non-aggression, and partly one of that norm's being enforced when necessary by military means. And just to give a current illustration, one justification for supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia is to preserve its sovereignty. That would be an independent just cause. But another, and especially important to the Baltic republics and Poland, is to deter Russia from future aggressions against them, or at least to avoid the encouragement of such aggressions there would be if its attack on Ukraine were unresisted. A related one is to have similar deterrent or non-encouraging effects on China vis-a-vis Taiwan. And to take up an earlier suggestion, these additional deterrence justifications may make support for Ukraine not just a permissible option for other states, but a positive obligation. I might actually say the current issue of The Economist has got an article by the foreign minister of Latvia talking about why it's important to support Ukraine against Russia. And it's all about deterrence. That's the central theme. But by further way of illustration, these conditional causes were multiply involved in the 1991 Gulf War that prompted the paper I'm talking about. Thus, in the ceasefire agreement that ended the war, the US and its allies agreed to suspend military operations on condition that Iraq eliminate and show that it eliminated its weapons of mass destruction. And that assumed that the allies would otherwise be permitted to use force to eliminate those weapons or to at least partially disarm Iraq. One aim of the war, beyond the liberation of Kuwait, was to prevent or deter a further Iraqi aggression against Saudi Arabia. But another, prominent in the rhetoric around the war, was to help inaugurate what was called a new world order. So the war was, unusually for then or now or any time, authorized by UN Security Council resolutions. So there was no veto from the Soviet Union or Russia. And it was fought by a large coalition involving not just the US and its Western allies, but many other states, including Arab ones. The idea was that this unprecedented level of international military cooperation would establish a practice of more effective resistance to aggression than had been possible before, and so would deter better than before, i.e., it would raise the level of deterrence above what it was before Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And deterrence also figured in the assessment of alternatives to the war. Before it began, there were several attempts to resolve Iraq's conflict with Kuwait by diplomacy. But the US and its main ally, Britain, kept insisting that there must be, quote, no rewards for aggression, i.e. an acceptable settlement could not induce Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait by offering it concessions in other areas, since that would be the opposite of deterrent. And I have to say that to me, this last concern with deterrence was underweighted in the paper's commentary on the Gulf War. Its main charge was that the war violated the necessity condition, since its principal just cause, the liberation of Kuwait, could have been achieved less harmfully by the continued application of economic sanctions. Now, to me, in retrospect, that is overly optimistic about the efficacy of sanctions. But more importantly, the paper acknowledged that a settlement reached via sanctions would probably involve some concessions to Iraq, but it thought that this wasn't a serious demerit, since it would be largely or even completely offset by the positive value in setting a precedent of the peaceful resolution of disputes. But to me, a peaceful resolution is only a good precedent if it's a good resolution, and I don't think this one would have been good. I mean, it would have sent the message that you can commit aggression, be opposed by a large coalition, including the world's major powers, and still come out ahead. And I don't think that's a message that there's value in sending. Anyways, my main concern isn't the 91 Gulf War. I mean, this is some of you probably weren't born. But just an interjection. I mean, the 1980s was all about nuclear deterrence in the literature, the philosophical literature. And then the Iron Curtain fell, and people switched to just war theory. And the Gulf War was the first sort of example of that to prompt discussion. So at least that's the war I think about. Anyways, my main concern isn't the Gulf War. It's to defend the general count of conditional causes in the Gulf War paper, which I continue to find persuasive, against the restrictions Jeff placed on it in later writings. The first and more severe of these came in a paper called Just Cause for War. So whereas the earlier paper had allowed conditional causes to help make a war proportional, this one said the only goods that can count in a proportionality assessment involve the prevention or correction of wrongs for which those warred against are responsible, where their responsibility makes them liable to the use of force to correct the wrongs. And it said, maybe more importantly, of the idea that pursuit of an end that by itself is insufficient to justify the killing and maiming of war can nonetheless contribute to justifying a war, an idea central to that of a merely conditional just cause, that it makes no sense. So what's supposed to make no sense is that something that doesn't by itself justify war can contribute nonetheless contribute to the justification of war. That's just, to me, denying the possibility of a conditional just cause. Because to say that it can contribute to the justification of war is to say that it's some kind of just cause. But to say that it has to by itself justify war is to say it has to be an independent just cause. It can't be conditional. So the upshot of this makes no sense argument, as I called it once, was if the only goods relevant to a war is proportionality are ones that can themselves justify it, i.e. ones in an independent just cause. So no merely conditional just causes can figure. Jeff didn't think it follows that disarmament and deterrence can never figure. The paper allowed that if a state's wrongful acts have reduced the general level of deterrence to below what it was before, that's a further wrong it's responsible for and makes it liable to the use of force to restore the previous level. In that circumstance, deterrence is a just cause, it's even an independent just cause. But it was strongly implied in the paper that only in that circumstance is it a just cause. So a state isn't liable to force to improve on a previous level or to deter potential aggressors more than they were before its aggression, as the Gulf War paper hadn't forbidden, and the Allies in 1991 hoped their New World Order would do. That pursuit of deterrence was now ruled out. A similar view seemed at least implicit about disarmament. Jeff now said that his earlier paper was wrong to say disarmament can only be a conditional just cause. It can be an independent just cause, he argued, if a state, though not yet having committed aggression, is manifestly intending and planning to do so. And though the paper didn't say this, the makes no sense argument seems to imply that only then is disarmament a just cause. If a defeated aggressor doesn't now intend any future aggression, as Germany and Japan didn't in 1945, how does forcibly incapacitating it for future aggression prevent a wrong it's now responsible for, and therefore now liable to force to prevent? The argument seems to allow disarmament and deterrence to count towards a war's proportionality only in very restricted contexts, one where a state is specifically responsible either for future wrong acts by now intending them, or for a wrongful reduction in deterrence, i.e. in contexts where they're not conditional causes. But to me, the argument that underwrites these claims is fallacious. In assuming there's something nonsensical in holding that a good that can't by itself justify a war can nonetheless contribute to its justification, it commits what Shelley calls the additive fallacy, or as I would say, it ignores the possibility that the morality of war might involve an analog of G.E. Moore's principle of organic unities. That principle, recall, says that the value of a whole needn't equal the sum of the values its parts would have on their own. So if X has got 10 units of value on its own and Y has got 0, the result when X and Y are combined by relation R into a whole XRY may be not 10 units, but perhaps 15. Then the presence in the whole of Y, which has no value on its own, adds 5 units of value that there wouldn't be if X weren't also present. And the same can in principle be true, I think, in the morality of war. The force licensed on its own by a state's aggression may be a certain amount. The force licensed on its own by the fact that war against it will disarm it for future aggression or deter others may be 0. But once the state is aggressed, that war will disarm it or deter others can increase the amount of force allowed. What has no justifying force on its own can add some given the right accompaniment. Or to put the point in terms of liability, a fact that doesn't on its own make a state liable to the use of force can increase the amount it's liable to if it's already liable on some other ground. So that's an in principle possibility. Of course, it doesn't follow that it's actually realized in the morality of war, but to me, it just is plausible that it's realized in the morality of war. That's made plausible just first by the analogy Jeff himself introduced with punishment. There it's permissible to imprison someone to prevent them from committing future crimes, even if he doesn't yet intend any such crimes. So something that can't justify punishing him if he hasn't acted wrongly becomes a legitimate aim if he has. It's also permissible to use his imprisonment to deter others, even if his crime hasn't lowered the general level of deterrence, as most crimes don't. And in particular, it's permissible to use his punishment to improve an existing level of deterrence. For example, by responding to a worrying increase in a certain crime by making its punishment somewhat more severe, if that will deter it somewhat better. And to me, there's similar plausibility in the parallel claims about war, such as that it's permissible to disarm a defeated aggressor even if it doesn't yet intend further aggression, or imagining that fighting a war with a large international coalition, as in the Gulf War, is somewhat less efficient because of the greater coordination of forces it requires, and therefore somewhat more costly or harmful. If fighting the war that way really will significantly increase the level of deterrence from what it was before, and thereby significantly reduce the number of deaths there will be from future wars, it to me is acceptably proportionate now. So, what I've called the makes no sense argument is, to me, unpersuasive, and actually, in later writing, Jeff himself repudiated it, or more accurately, restricted its range of application. In a paper called Proportionality and Just Cause, he described two ways in which a good that can't by itself justify war can nonetheless contribute to a war's justification, or allowed two possibilities that his original argument had denied. Neither possibility, however, allows the pursuit of disarmament and deterrence as merely conditional goods or in contexts other than the ones he had earlier allowed. So the first possibility involves that goods that are of the right type to be independent just causes, and so to justify killing, but aren't substantial enough to do so on their own. One might be an enemy's occupying some tiny unused part of our territory. And here Jeff argued that there are enough of these goods, their combined weight can be sufficient to justify war and the use of force to achieve them, so they become legitimate goals as a result of being part of this bigger package. But that argument isn't relevant to disarmament and deterrence because they aren't goods of the right type. No amount of deterrence, for example, can be an independent just cause or make a state liable to force to achieve it. So though in this first way, some goods that don't themselves justify killing can be part of a larger one that does, the previously excluded forms of disarmament and deterrence aren't among them. Their pursuit is still forbidden. And the same is true, at least for practical purposes, of the second possibility. It invoked a distinction that was not made in the Gulf War paper between proportionality in a narrow and proportionality in a wide sense. Narrow proportionality concerns the amount of harm that may permissibly be caused those who are liable to the use of force, typically enemy soldiers. Wide proportionality permits harm. Wide proportionality concerns the amount that may be caused those who aren't liable, typically civilians. So when wide proportionality permits harm, the justification is a lesser evil justification. It says that those harmed aren't liable to harm. Harming them is permitted because its benefits to others are so great. And Jeff's argument now was that a good whose pursuit isn't permitted by narrow proportionality, because no one is liable to force to promote it, can count in favor of a war by contributing in a lesser evil way to its wide proportionality, or to justifying the harms it will cause non-liable people. While narrow proportionality was still governed by the makes no sense argument, wide proportionality now allowed a broader range of goods. The problem with this second possibility is that lesser evil justification is a comparatively weak one. For it to justify harming non-liable people, the resulting benefits must be not just somewhat, but significantly greater than the harms. And that's especially true when the harms will be not collateral, as when civilians are killed as a side effect of bombing a military target, but directly intended. For the directly intended killing of a non-liable person to be permitted on lesser evil grounds, the resulting benefits have to be vastly greater. But the pursuit of disarmament or improved deterrence that I'm defending as permitted involves the intentional harming and potential killing of enemy soldiers who, on Jeff's later view, aren't liable with respect to those goals. Does that make sense? They're not liable to the use of force to improve deterrence on the level that it was before they committed their deterrence, before they participated in the aggression. So improving on a previous level of a deterrence, for example, doesn't correct a wrong the soldiers are responsible for, and therefore doesn't meet the view's condition for their being liable. But the pursuit of this good will direct force at the soldiers, and so will be justified on lesser evil grounds only if the benefits of the improved deterrence are vastly greater than the harms it causes them, which I suspect will rarely, if ever, be the case. So though the second argument creates a possibility in principle that using force to disarm an enemy that doesn't now intend further aggression or to improve on a previous level of deterrence can be permitted, in practice that possibility will almost never be realized. And actually this issue arises in Jeff's reply to Daniel Statman about the war in Gaza. This is in the article that Jeff circulated to some of us and which I urge everyone to read. So Statman had said it's a merit of the war that has deterred Iran and Hezbollah from future attacks on Israel, and in particular has caused them to be more deterred than they were before the attack by Hamas on Israel that prompted the war. Jeff replies that pursuing deterrence by force is permitted when an enemy's wrongful act has weakened deterrence from a previous level, so its fighters are liable to force to restore that level. I mean, that's the context in which he said, way back that the pursuit of deterrence was permitted. And I think the implication in the reply to Statman is, again, that that's the only context in which it's permitted. But then he says, but that inflicting harms on non-liable people for deterrent purposes is terrorism, and therefore I think except in unusual circumstances, forbidden. Now, civilians in Gaza are indeed not liable to be harmed, so directing force at them would be terrorism. But what about inflicting harms on Hamas fighters in order to improve a previous level of deterrence? As I said, I don't see how on Jeff's view the fighters are liable to force for this purpose, since it doesn't correct a wrong they're responsible for. And I therefore don't see how on his view this too wouldn't be terrorism. My own view is that if the war did result in enhanced deterrence of Iran, and did so by aiming force only at the fighters, that would count in the war's favor. It might not come close to justifying all the harms to civilians the war has caused. I mean, it might not come close to satisfying the requirement of wide proportionality. It might be totally inadequate for that, but I think it would be a relevant benefit, just as it would be a relevant benefit if Ukraine's resistance to Russia was so effective that it made Russia less likely to attack the Baltic republics than before it invaded Ukraine, and China less likely to invade Taiwan. But that's because I think the participation by Hamas fighters and Russian soldiers in wrongful acts made them liable to force not only to prevent those acts from succeeding, but also to promote the additional goods of disarmament and possibly enhanced deterrence. How am I for time? Pardon? You talk slower now. No. Well, I'm gonna. It's good. Maybe I've been talking too fast. I want to close by venturing a more general comment about liability. I have to say I do this with some trepidation because I haven't followed the literature on this topic as closely as I should have. So, maybe people can tell me I'm completely wrong. But it seems to me that there are two senses of liability, one broad and one narrow. In the broad sense, you're being liable means you're committing. It's not intending or committing a wrong, because some of the examples that Victor was discussing, but you're liable if some act of yours makes certain treatments of you that otherwise would be impermissible, permissible. But there's so far no specification of what those treatments can be or what your act has made you liable to. In the narrow sense, you're being liable means that you're doing or intending this act makes treatments of you aimed at preventing or rectifying. I originally wrote it with wrongs, and it's not only wrong. Can I just restrict it to the case where what makes you liable is a wrong, which is really what's relevant in the war case. So in the broad sense, You're committing or intending to commit a wrong makes certain treatments of you that otherwise would be impermissible permissible, but there's so far no specification of what those treatments can be. In the narrow sense, you're being liable means you're committing or intending a wrong, makes treatments of you aimed at preventing or rectifying that wrong, and only those treatments permissible. So to me, Jeff's makes no sense argument, and his continued affirmation, as I see it, for liability justifications or assessments of narrow proportionality, assume the narrow sense. They assume that what a wrong makes you liable for is only action to prevent or rectify that specific wrong. But I don't see a general basis for this assumption, especially since it seems not present in the morality of punishment, where again, committing a crime makes imprisoning you to incapacitate you for future crime and deter others permissible, even though you aren't in the narrow sense liable to those treatments. And I'm going to venture another comment that Helen told me, just before the session is just conceptually confused. But I get paid for conceptual confusion. To me, Jeff's, later liability based account of the morality of war is based largely, or at least partly, on an analogy with individual self-defense, and even sees the morality of war as an extension of that of self-defense, involving just collective rather than individual action to defend individual rights. But self-defense does seem to involve, at least to me intuitively, only the narrow sense of liability. I again haven't followed the self-defense literature as much as others here have, but it seems to me that if I've successfully repelled your attack, so it's now over, I'm not permitted to impose further harms on you to incapacitate you from attacking me again in the future. Thus, I'm not permitted, after repelling your attack, to break your arm so you can't use it to attack me later. Nor, I don't think I'm permitted to just take away the pool cue that you beat me with. Nor, if a lesser amount of force would successfully repel your attack, am I permitted to use more force because that would more effectively deter others. I mean, if I could repel your attack by breaking your arm, but it would deter others better if I broke both your legs. I'm sounding like Francis. Can I say, I'm just kidding. I have 12 minutes, so. Piece of cake. Actually, one of the things, I wrote a little bit about the morality of war, and one of the things I like about it is that the examples you discuss, or you can discuss, are real-life examples. I mean, the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, they're not made-up examples. And I have to say, Francis's example yesterday involved conceiving a child by an act that at the same time plants a bomb that will kill the conceived child 20 years later. That is some very kinky sex. Anyways, but I also think, I also think that, the morality of self-defense, the amount of force that's necessary is the amount of force, the least amount of force needed to successfully repel this attack. The fact that more force would more effectively deter other people doesn't make the additional force permitted. What counts as necessary force is just the force needed to repel, the attacker now. Effects on others are irrelevant. So to me, the morality of self-defense doesn't allow the pursuit of conditional causes in the way the morality of punishment does. It does involve just a narrow form of liability. Well, I don't have an explanation for this difference. It seems, at least to me, intuitively to be there. And it means that if conditional causes like disarmament and deterrence are legitimate aims in war, an analogy with self-defense isn't the best basis for the morality of war. An analogy with punishment is better, not because war is a matter of punishment or because punishment is a just cause, but because the two have got a similar structure, one that's more permissive than self-defense is in allowing the pursuit not only of independent, but also of conditional just aims. But then, the analogy with punishment is the one that Jeff and Robert McKim used in their Gulf War paper that I had the pleasure of helping into print 30 plus years ago. The analogy then supported a, to me, persuasive and illuminating idea of conditional just causes, in particular disarmament and deterrence. And I still find that persuasive and illuminating today. So thanks.
Thank you, Jeff, for your mentorship, your support, and your friendship over the years. You've heard so many times I won't go into large details, but I do want to relate one anecdote to people. So I wrote Jeff cold in 1994. I don't know if you remember. I remember our first email exchange. I wrote to say to him that I'd read something that he'd written, and I was working on something that was related. I honestly don't remember exactly what I was working on. I remember the article he wrote. It was Self-Defense and the Problem of the Innocent Attacker. And the article really impressed me, and I basically said, hi, you don't know me from Adam, but I loved your article, and I wonder if you take a look at something I'm working on. And of course, he generously said, sure, and I'm sure you gave me interesting and helpful comments, but the other thing you said was, somebody's reading me. Now, maybe it was true that that was a novelty to you back in 1994. Hopefully you understand it's no longer something you need to say. Okay. Anyway, and thank you also to Alad for organizing this wonderful event. Ton of work, well done, Alad. Thanks to Tom for the astute commentary on Jeff's evolving or devolving thoughts on the limits of the justifiability of war. Now, normally in my experience, when you give comments, you summarize the paper that you're going to comment on. But since it's first thing in the morning and you're all caffeinated and ready to go and you've just heard the paper, I'm just going to dive right in and skip the summary. So what I want to focus on in Tom's remarks is the comparison he draws and that Jeff once drew between war and punishment, and the application of that comparison to the distinction Jeff once drew between independent justifying reasons and conditional justifying reasons. So to recap on those concepts, independent justifying reasons can justify something directly. They're inherently relevant to its justification, resisting aggression in the case of war, holding people accountable for culpable wrongdoing in the case of punishment. Conditional justifying reasons can help make the act justified, all things considered, but they cannot justify a thing on their own. The paradigm case seems to be offsetting costs. Costs of engaging in war, of course, include harm to innocents, harm to soldiers, economic costs, for example, huge debts to make things that just blow up, diseases and famines, and cultural costs, like making for a more bellicose, violent society. Costs of punishment, harm to innocents who are wrongly punished, harm to the families and communities of those who are justly punished and removed from their productive roles in the community, harm to the guilty, loss of careers, families, etc., not to mention the intended loss of freedom and/or money. Economic costs incurred to run the system of punishment. Cultural costs, for example, making society more punitive. In both cases, it seems sensible to look to benefits that can offset the costs. These should be kept distinct from independent justifying reasons, but they're relevant to the all things considered justification. Benefits of just wars. Some of these apply to unjust wars as well, but we can assume those are barred by lack of independent justification. Deterrence of aggression, quite generally. Disarmament of a dangerous state that unjustly aggressed. Reinforcement of legal norms. Medical advances that flow from operating on people harmed by weapons or diseases triggered by wars. Economic stimulation of a Keynesian sort. Building community spirit with a rally round the flag effect. Benefits of just punishment. These won't apply to all forms of punishment. For example, fines, community service don't do much to incapacitate, but here's some general benefits. Deterrence of criminal behavior, both specific and general. Incapacitation of dangerous people. Opportunity for forced rehabilitation. Reinforcing respect for the law. and employment in the prison industrial complex. One might think, and Tom does think, that the benefits can do more than provide a counterweight to the costs, that they can also expand what it's permissible to do. In the punishment context, Tom thinks that general deterrence can give us reason to ratchet up punishment. I'm not sure you actually kept this line in the paper, but in the paper as I saw it, he had the following quote: "If the incidence of some crime excuse me, is troublingly high, so it's insufficiently deterred, it seems perfectly permissible to make prison terms for it somewhat longer than it will if that will deter it somewhat more." And he likewise thinks in the context of war that more deterrence helps justify more war, right? For example, in the Russian context, in the invasion of Ukraine, right? Doing more to deter Russia from attacking the Baltic republics will justify more fighting in Ukraine. Excuse me. Now, Tom says that Jeff moved away from this framework, and Tom now wants to call him back to it. But I want to raise a concern that I think Jeff probably has. I'm speculating here, you can correct me if I'm wrong. One that might give him a reason to resist. The danger is that these conditional reasons, by expanding what can be justified, can distort the practices in question, presenting as justifiable what is in fact unjustifiable. The danger in the context of the criminal law is clear. It's a mistake to think that if the defendant, D, commits a crime, he can then be punished in any way that makes his punishment, all things considered, good. Criminal activity is not just the trigger that opens the gate to consequentialist analysis. Tom flirts with neglecting this point in the language I quoted above, allowing somewhat longer sentences if they produce somewhat better deterrence. Now, I'll grant that what Tom says is true if we put sufficient emphasis on somewhat. That's because the constraints of proportionality and punishment are far from exact. Nonetheless, it's important to recognize that there's an intrinsic proportionality limit built into the idea that punishment is tied to blame, right? Censure and punishment must be proportional to the overall culpability of the wrongdoing. The conditional reasons that support punishment can be cabined by reference to that limit. It's not immediately clear, however, how that cabining is supposed to work with self-defense or national defense as an analog of punishment. Without a desert notion, we're in danger of being at sea, in the same way punishment would be if criminal actions were just a trigger for unleashing conditional consequentialist reasons. This could leave Jeff to want to respond to Tom by saying that we need a limiting principle. And the best way to find it is to say that what can be done is fully limited by the independent justifying reasons. That in turn can explain why we have to avoid appealing to positive goals like general deterrence and disarmament of aggressors. But now that I've spelled out a potential response for Jeff, I want to turn around and say I don't like it. I think that Tom is right that we should be able to justify wars, including the collateral damage they cause, the intentional damage they cause, right here, collateral, intentional, and the time frame over which they take place, with reference to goals other than defeating that particular aggressor and preventing it from profiting from the unjust aggression, but also with goals like disarming them and creating general deterrence of unjust aggression. To do that, I want to revisit the distinction Tom developed at the end of his presentation between narrow sense of liability and the broad sense of liability, where the latter is more open-ended, not limited to preventing or rectifying the wrong. I suggest we think of breadth in a distinctly political way. I think this is key to understanding the criminal law. A criminal defendant does not just wrong or harm one or more victims. Sometimes there are no victims. A criminal defendant violates the law. Violation of the law is a public concern. The law's punishment is a public response. The people, not just the victim, condemn the act. The punishment is a way of extracting a guilt debt the wrongdoer owes the political community. We can extend that to self-defense. Suppose A attacks B. Most of us, Tom included, Victor excluded, reflexively think that A is not thereby made liable to extra harm to deter C from attacking D. But we can redeem the thought that he is liable to extra harm if it will help C from attacking D, or help deter C from attacking D. Start by noting that A is not only liable to self-defense, he owes compensation. We don't normally allow Bs to help themselves to compensation because we disapprove of self-help, for good reason, when the courts are open. But we allow Bs to sue after the assault is over for the tort. Maybe I'm going to sue you for that pool cue you hit me with, right? Now generalize that. A's attack on B was not only an attack on B, it was an attack on the law. The state, speaking for the law, can extract A's guilt debt from him in the form of punishment that deters C from attacking D. Why not view the situation the same when dealing with countries? Of course, there's no international court that could enforce a legal settlement, so a country will have to engage in self-help, perhaps supported by allies or even, in rare periods in history, the United Nations. Resorting to self-help is worrisome and problematic, but so is not being free to do so. So I'll put that concern aside. The fundamental positive point is that we can understand the relevance of goals like general deterrence and disarmament as collecting on the state's debt with regard to international law. In other words, Tom is mistaken to think that Jeff should go back to giving more weight to conditional reasons in support of war. But Tom was right to think that Jeff's conception of the reasons that work to justify war has been excessively narrowed. We should take a more capacious view of the justifying reasons that favor war. They're not limited to stopping a single act of aggression and preventing the degradation of deterrence. They should include disarmament of dangerous aggressors and general deterrence. To make this point work, however, we have to move away from modeling war simply on self-defense. We have to see it in a larger political context. In addition, we can't just use the twofold categories of independent justification and contingent justification. So let me end by suggesting that we adopt a threefold distinction. First, fundamental justifications. Punishment holds wrongdoers accountable for culpable lawbreaking. War defends against unjustified aggression, at least if it's just war. Second, inherently relevant justifications can extend the scope of what is justifiable in pursuit of the fundamental justifications. Achieving general deterrence and promoting respect for the law are part of what criminal lawbreakers owe, and thus are relevant to setting a measure of proportional punishment. Being subject to disarmament and promoting general respect for the law against aggression are part of what aggressive states owe, and thus are relevant to setting a measure of the just use of force in war. Third, cost offsetting justifications. Any benefits can outweigh the costs, but they cannot be appealed to in order to extend what may be done. No extra punishment to provide employment in prisons. No extra killings to provide more fodder for medical research. In the end, I'm suggesting a stronger connection to criminal law than Tom had in mind, but I'm still not suggesting that they're the same thing. Criminal law is a blaming institution. Warfare is, or should be, a defensive institution. Still, the parallels are deep and show that just war theory should not be modeled too closely on self-defense. I wonder whether Tom will take that the friendly amendment it's meant to be, and I wonder whether Jeff can embrace the point as well. I suspect that for him it will run into problems having to do with his commitment to reductive individualism. But taking on that topic is a bridge too far for these comments. With that, I yield for the discussion.
So thank you very much. Just for reasons of time, can I invite everyone to be really succinct? So we started slightly late, but we will finish on time as before. Just hold your hands up until I've just given you a nod, and I'll get the cue going from there. And Tom has an immediate quick response.
I just want to say about the first part of Alec's comments. I didn't say, but I believe that the morality of punishment is governed by conditions of, get Jeff for sure, of proportionality and necessity. So executing people for shoplifting might be tremendously deterrent, but it's forbidden because it's a disproportionate punishment. And it's, I'll stop at that.
Right. So first, let's just take it as given that we don't want to be retributivists about punishment.
Sorry, that we are or are not?
We are not retributivists about punishment. So that even if... Okay, so sorry, I'll motivate this. So, Kant says, even if someone has committed a crime and the world is about to end and it does no good whatsoever to punish him, that person deserves punishment. Let's set that view to one side. There needs to be some good done by punishment. I'm just going to make the case that general deterrence has to be playing a role. So it might be congenial to what Alec was saying. So suppose that people can commit only one crime, in the way bees can sting only once, but they remain alive. Let's just leave aside the possibility of incapacitation or prevention. Here then, we're forced to a general deterrence-based justification of punishment because, once a person commits a crime, then you'd say, okay, well, deterrence has failed against that person, and if you then don't follow through and punish him, then other people won't have any reason of deterrence not to commit crimes. And so I think that just cases like that will drive us to a general deterrence-based justification of punishment. Yeah, it is friendly to probably both of you. And
Good.
Perhaps a challenge to Jeff.
Well, I want to thank you both for those papers, as both of them extremely rich and inspiring in all kinds of ways. I'm still inclined to adhere to the view that war, punishment, and self-defense all have the same moral foundations and are governed by the same principles. And in my view, the primary aims of both are, as I think Tom said early on, the prevention or rectification of wrongs. And that's an old view in just war theory, by the way. That's a very old view of the notion of just cause. And the prevention and rectification of wrongs is governed by what Tom referred to as narrow proportionality. You inflict harms that are proportionate only in relation to the liability of the person responsible for the wrong that is to be prevented or rectified. So I still think that there are at least two forms of justification for harming people in war. One is a liability justification for harming those who are responsible for the wrong that is to be prevented or rectified. And then there are lesser evil justifications for harming people who are not liable to be harmed or harming people beyond their liability. And this is governed by the wide proportionality constraint, which takes the form normally as a limit to what can be justified as the lesser evil in the circumstances. And I guess I'm just willing to accept the idea that if soldiers in a war are not liable to be harmed as a means of, for example, deterring other countries in the future, that is improving deterrence, as Tom says, then the harm to them does have to be justified as the lesser evil. I do think that we can see most, take contemporary cases. I'm sorry I'm going on for a little while, but there was so much to be said. You said so much, covered so much ground. But consider the example that you both used of Ukraine and the deterrence of Russia from attacking other countries in the region, Baltic countries, Poland, other countries. I do see the justification for that as not so much the improving of deterrence as the restoration of deterrence. We all know that Russia has this tendency to want to recapture all the territories that were once part of Russia or the Soviet Empire. So I think what's necessary in Ukraine really can be justified as restoring the level of deterrence or maintaining the level of deterrence there was before Russia attacked Ukraine. Now, the case of China and Taiwan is quite different. And there we have to ask, okay, one good effect of defeating Russia in Ukraine would be, it would tell the Chinese something about the resistance to aggression. Now, I don't think Russian soldiers are liable to be harmed to deter China from attacking Taiwan. Therefore, I do think that if the successful outcome of Ukraine's defense against Russia would actually strengthen deterrence of China with respect to Taiwan, that would be a good effect of the war. That would count in proportionality, but I think it would count in wide proportionality rather than narrow proportionality, and would have to be justified as the lesser evil. I was going to say what Mike said as well. I mean, as I said, I want to say that punishment and self-defense in war are all justified by the same principles, and I would exclude retribution as an aim in punishment as well as war and defense. So what I'm saying about war, I think I would want to apply to punishment as well.
Yeah, my half-baked suggestion that self-defense and punishment were different, that's what Helen told me was conceptually confused. So, but that's not really the main point of the talk. But just take a lesser evil justification. It normally applies to justifying the collateral harms to non-liable people of force directed at those who are liable. But if you're talking about a lesser evil justification of force directed at people who are non-liable, that's a justification of terrorism. And that's got to meet a very, very high standard. So what I was suggesting sort of in the Gaza case was that if the force was directed at Hamas fighters and they weren't liable, the deterrent effect would be part of a lesser evil justification only if it was a justification of terrorism. I mean, one of the things I didn't say in the paper was that if the Hamas fighters are not liable with respect to improved deterrence of Iran, and I think Iran is now more deterred than it was before the war began, then if you were to pursue that, it wouldn't matter whether you directed force at civilians or Hamas fighters because they're equally non-liable. But anyways, the point is that there's a lesser evil justification of collateral harms to non-liable people of acts that targeted liable people. And there's a lesser evil justification of the harms caused non-liable people by force directed at them. And the second is a much higher bar. And that's what I was talking about.
Just a quick word before you go, Saba. So, Jeff, I just want to say your last thought was really interesting, that the soldier, what it highlighted for me was that you think of the soldiers as being liable only in the very narrow context in which that war is justified for that particular unjust aggression. And I think the point I was trying to make is to broaden their liability, not to suggest that you can go after the non-liable.
Yeah, and that's a question of broad liability as well. I see the force of that when you distinguish between directing force intentionally at Hamas militants for aims for which they are not liable, and directing force at Gaza civilians for the achievement of purposes that are not liable. I accept that that's a highly intuitive comment.
Thanks. So it seems to me that Jeff's account that soldiers are not liable to harms that advance conditional just causes, such as deterrence, has a distinct advantage. So on his view, to explain what harms the soldiers are liable to, we might appeal to a theory of responsibility. So if they are responsible for degrading deterrence relative to the status quo ante, then they're liable to harms to restore the deterrence level, but not if not. Now, on the account that Tom, you're espousing, and Alec too, it seems that what you need is a theory of what harms the soldiers are liable to, a theory that explains why Russian soldiers are liable to the harms that prevent Chinese soldiers from attacking Taiwan. Now, Alec helpfully provided the beginnings of a contour of such a theory. It's not a theory of responsibility, especially individual responsibility. Rather, it's a theory of something having to do with international politics, the international political order, that might explain why an attack on the international order redounds to the liability of individual soldiers. Aside from the fact that that seems like, once again, a deterrence, like that there was an attack that degraded deterrence, and now we have to restore it. That's what an attack on the international political order sounds like. That's not what you want, obviously, but that's initially what it sounds like. It has to be something else. And whatever else it is, I would have thought that deterrence, disarmament would serve as a conditional just cause of the sort that would render soldiers liable, even if the international order were utterly degraded, even if we were in a state of international anarchy. There's no UN, there's no ICC, there's no norms of conduct. You'd still want these to serve as conditional just causes that put the soldiers on the hook as far as liability is concerned. And if that's the case, then it can't be the international political order that's doing the work.
I might throw out something that I left out of the talk. I mean, Jeff's view seems to imply that we would be required to let the level of general deterrence slowly slide down. Because I think it's plausible that the deterrent effect of a successful resistance to aggression is greatest right after the resistance has happened, and then memory fades and the deterrent effect weakens. So imagine that right now the level of general deterrence is 10. An aggression is commenced. If it were unresisted, it would drop to 6. Now, on Jeff's view, we're permitted to use force to bring it back to 10. But then over time, it drifts down to 8. And then another aggression is attempted, which, if it's unresisted, will take it down to 4. Now, all we're permitted to do is bring it back to 8, because that's the existing level of deterrence. And then after a while, the next time we can bring it back to 6, the next time we could bring it back to 4. So I think it's permissible to maintain a general average level of general deterrence through time, even though at individual moments that requires using force to increase the level of deterrence from what it was before. You see, there's the fans of deterrence like Mike who are nodding their heads.
Can I just say, I know the question was directed to Alec, and we're butting in here, but I agree with that. It's just that in the second case, the justification for going from 4 to 8, I think has got to be different from the justification for going from 8 to 10 at that point. There may be justifications for both, but they are not necessarily the same type of justification.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can say something real quick. Okay. So the real quick comment, Saba, you were suggesting that if there's no state, then there's no political space for this. I just want to refer to the distinction between mala prohibita crimes and mala in se crimes, and say that I think there is a reason for countries, individuals, groups to try to create an order to enforce the mala in se wrongs or prevention of them.
Thanks. I didn't know Jeff in 1991, so I want to defend my Jeff against this previous inferior version. So I think and my question is about the general idea of conditional just cause rather than deterrence in particular. So the idea of conditional just cause seems plausible when we think about the conditional just cause as just kind of getting us over the line of the proportionality limit, right? They just kind of add this little extra bit. But it seems much less plausible when the conditional just causes provide the vast majority of the good side of the proportionality calculation, and the independent just causes just providing one sort of tiny little element. And that becomes especially apparent if we compare alternative wars that we might pursue. So imagine in the first war, we're going to kill 1,000 people, but we have no independent just cause. So that cannot be, but we have lots and lots of conditional just cause. And then we have a second war where we're going to kill 2,000 people. We have less conditional just cause, so we do much less good, but we're going to save one innocent life. So we have now independent just cause. So now we're going to cause this could be proportionate because we've got all this conditional just cause going on. So now we're going to cause an extra 1,000 deaths. We're going to save one additional life directly, but let's say we're going to save 10,000 fewer lives indirectly. Now, the second war is going to end up being proportionate, and the first war is going to be disproportionate. The general point is that almost in that second war, almost all the proportionality is coming from the conditional just causes, and then you just add in this one little bit of independent just cause, and that's going to make it permissible, and that seems implausible. Sorry, I kind of threw a case at you a bit quickly there, but hopefully you get the general point.
I'll just say I see that difficulty.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lectures. I will be quick. I'm not sure what the language of conditional independent is actually doing. I think that if we have defensive rights, so we have a just cause, and then there are just aims. And if we have defensive rights, we are justified in resisting aggression, then we have just aims. So deterrence can be one of them. Incapacitation is another. I think also that these are, because we take those concepts from criminal law, deterrence works through changing the adversary's cost-benefit analysis, whereas incapacitation is the use of force in order to deny the aggressor from a certain capabilities, like the latest attack of Ukraine on the long-range bombers. I also think that once we established, instead of speaking about conditional and independent, why not look at it through the lens of risk? So if you two are neighbors, okay, and Alec will slap you on your hand every day. So I would say that at some point it would be justified to break your hand, but that would be because of war, say, is different from one encounter. So when we have repeated games, say, there is a different mechanism that justify the just aim of deterrence. And then there would be, of course, questions of proportionality. Also, there was a lot of, I don't know if it was conflation between permissibility and proportionality. Inflicting deterrent harm can be proportionate or not, of course, based on who is it that you're trying to deter, and that's it.
I mean, just at the beginning, there were just defensive aims, something like that. What I thought was great about the idea of conditional just causes was deterrence and disarmament on their own don't justify the use of force. So, I mean, starting a war against a country might deter all sorts of other people. It's not okay, just because there isn't one of the independent just causes. I thought that was, I guess I like the Jeff of his youth and my youth. The days of wine and roses. So I thought that was an important and useful distinction.
Yeah, thanks. So this is very quick. So I'm interested in this notion of broad liability, and I'm just wondering, what's the principle that governs what you get to do to somebody by virtue of their broad liability, right? It seemed like that there was a lot of goods that could possibly go into sort of, achieving in order when somebody was broadly liable. But presumably not everything's on the table, right? There must be, the mere fact that somebody's broadly liable doesn't mean that you get to achieve whatever good that you want. So what goods count and what don't?
I mean, So, first of all, broad liability is just a sense of liability that doesn't make a claim about what the treatments are. And I mean, Jeff's view is that the only instance of broad liability is narrow liability. That's the only kind there is. But the concept doesn't. That's a substantive claim. It's not a claim about the very idea of liability. As to what explains why some treatments are permitted by liability and others aren't, I actually am kind of sympathetic to the idea that Jeff and Robert McMahan suggested in their paper, that the things that are permitted are the ones that relate to or contribute to the general aim of just warfare, which is preventing wrongs like aggression. Can I just make a final comment, because I don't even want to finish. When you start out in philosophy, you think, well, I'm going to write these articles, and they'll contain these arguments, and they'll persuade everybody, and then everybody will think the way I do. And it takes about 5 minutes before you realize there's no hope of that. So maybe one effect of this talk has been to sort of bring out clearly a distinction between two views about what, let's say, committing aggression makes a state liable to a narrower view, which is Jeff's and Alec's and other people's, and then a broader view, which is actually the view of all the people who make the decisions in the international realm and write about it in foreign affairs and places like that.
I have an argument for that.
Jeff, you stand between us and coffee, but it feels the
Okay, I have only 2 sentences, and that is, I'm mulling over this idea of distinction between broad and narrow liability, and the question was about that. And I just want to say, it seems to be very clear that if this kind of distinction can be drawn, one of the elements of broad liability is going to be some relatively high degree of culpability, and narrow liability could be based on minimal responsibility, something like that. And that would explain why you're finding broad liability more plausible in the case of criminal punishment than perhaps in war. Criminals who are punished are typically very different from soldiers fighting in an unjust war who normally have greatly excusing conditions and are not highly culpable. That's all. Thanks.
Can we say thank you very much?